going to continue our discussion of ecosystem dynamics today, as well as management of both ecosystems and species within ecosystems. So one of the important dynamics that we see within ecosystems is certainly that of the matter of ecosystems, the molecules, especially those that are important to life. And so as we've talked about before, matter recycles in ecosystems, so the atoms and molecules of which you and I are composed essentially are as old as the Earth itself. But it's the energy, of course, that passes through ecosystems that cannot be recycled, but the matter can. So when we look at these biogeochemical cycles then, there are certain common features that we see to them. And one is that for a particular important element, for example, nitrogen or phosphorus in particular that we're going to talk about, but carbon, oxygen, and others as well, there'll be some form that's useful to living things. And this useful form then will be assimilated by plants or taken up by plants, and then through the food chain passed to animals. And so basically the producers will take it up and pass it to consumers. So it doesn't have to be plants necessarily, it could be other types of producers. And then both plants and animals can die, and in their dead form we refer to dead plants and animals as detritus. And also animals will produce waste. And then these nutrients then are locked up in the decomposing tissue and the waste of plants and animals. And then decomposers, microorganisms, typically bacteria, archaea, and fungi, will decompose those organisms and return the useful form to the environment. So again, this could be an aquatic ecosystem, this could be a terrestrial ecosystem. So they continue to cycle then, through the food chain in this way. Now, what can happen is that sometimes this useful form, though, gets trapped in sediments, marine sediments or aquatic sediments, and essentially then they seemingly are out of the cycle. But the reality is, are they out of the cycle? Well, they're not out of the cycle forever. So basically, once the nutrients are trapped in sediments, what can happen is that the sediments, or what will happen is that the sediments are buried, and literally they can be miles deep, into the ocean floor. But eventually they will get back to the cycle. They'll eventually get back to the surface. And the way that they're going to get back to the surface is through geologic uplift. So, crustal plates, can crush together and then ride up over one another and eventually reach the surface and then be eroded and return that nutrient back to the ecosystem. Or also, they can also what we call subduct. The plates can actually one plate can be pushed under another. Eventually, that rock and sediment will melt and then be part of volcanic eruptions. So again, they might be out of the cycle for billions of years, but eventually these nutrients do get back into the cycle. So really nothing is ever out of the cycle. Eventually it has the potential to be reused again. So we're going to look at a couple of cycles, a few different cycles, and the first one is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle has kind of a cycle within a cycle in a sense. But when we look at the nitrogen cycle, we begin with nitrogen, N2, nitrogen gas. And nitrogen gas is really not a very friendly or useful form of nitrogen for living things. And so what happens is that nitrogen can be fixed by certain types of bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And the term fixing normally means either converting it to a useful form or attaching it to a carbon. And so in this particular case, what's going to happen is that nitrogen-fixing bacteria will reduce the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia or something called ammonium. And then nitrifying bacteria will convert that into either nitrites, NO2, or nitrates. And then these nitrates and nitrites can be assimilated and picked up by plants. So again, the useful form, some people will consider ammonium the useful form, but certainly the nitrates are useful forms, and those can be assimilated by plants, and nitrates are important in the production of amino acids for proteins. So then, once the plants have assimilated them, of course, they can be eaten by animals. Animals have their waste, they can both die, and eventually decomposers can return those nitrates to the soil again. So one cycle is that basically the nitrates will recycle basically through the food chain. Now the other aspect of this is that if you look at atmospheric nitrogen, it seems like there would be a net loss of atmospheric nitrogen, and about 80% of our atmosphere is actually nitrogen. So there would be this constant loss of N2 from the atmosphere if this was the only process ongoing. So nitrogen fixation takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere. However, there are also denitrifying bacteria which can take nitrate and regenerate atmospheric nitrogen. So again, the denitrifying bacteria will regenerate atmospheric nitrogen. The nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert it basically to ammonium, and eventually it will go to nitrate. So once it's a nitrate, again, it can cycle within the food chain, and decomposers will return it to the ecosystems. But again, we also have the cycle of atmospheric nitrogen being taken out and being regenerated again. And then one other factor in nitrogen cycling is lightning. Atmospheric nitrogen can be affected by lightning, and actually that can oxidize it to produce nitrates as well. So in some ecosystems, lightning actually produces a great deal of the useful form of nitrogen, being nitrate. Okay, now another important element, a limiting element in life is phosphorus. And here the useful form of phosphorus is phosphate. And fortunately, phosphate is a very stable molecule, so it will pretty much work through the kind of cycle that we talked about earlier. So phosphates can be taken up by plant roots, again assimilated by plant roots, basically work through the food chain and then be reassimilated. Phosphates also then will wash into sediments, and phosphates are again are very stable. So these are elements that are again a form of an element that can be trapped in sediments for a long time and then eventually returned either through uplift or volcanism. So again, I'm more or less focusing on terrestrial ecosystems, but again, these nutrients can cycle in aquatic or marine ecosystems as well. The carbon and oxygen cycle we have talked about, at least to some degree, when we talked about photosynthesis and the cellular oxidation of glucose. And anyway, basically, if we look at carbon in the form of carbon dioxide is pulled out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and that becomes organic molecules of plants, and that'll work its way through the food chain. And then animals, of course, will practice the cellular oxidation of glucose, returning carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So carbon is taken out of the atmosphere by the plants, it's going to be returned to the atmosphere by animals, but of course also any kind of combustion, any kind of burning, the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, used to be vegetation at one time. Also, burning of our forests, clearing forests for one reason or another, also will return that carbon to the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. And then, of course, plants generate atmospheric oxygen, although oxygen is not really listed on this cycle, but plants generate oxygen through photosynthesis, and animals will consume the oxygen in the cellular oxidation of glucose. And of course, oxygen is also consumed through combustion, and also decomposition also consumes oxygen as well. So again, that relates to those two cycles we talked about earlier in the course. Water cycle is pretty straightforward, but of course water is very important to life. Basically, water evaporates either from the oceans or seas. It cools, it condenses, it falls in the form of precipitation, either snow or rain. Then it runs off the surface back to the oceans or percolates into the soil and eventually works its way back to the oceans. Now, an exception to that, and again, kind of talking about that runoff then, the continental divide here in North America basically separates water that's going to drain into the Pacific as opposed to the Atlantic. And then also a basin, a continental basin, is a place where water, instead of running to an ocean, is going to run to the interior of that continent. So here in North America, we have the Great Basin, and the Great Basin basically is bordered on the west by the Sierra Nevadas, on the north by the Cascades, on the east by the Rocky Mountains, as well as a little bit to the south, and then also the high deserts. And so what happens then is that within that area, which is basically the states of Utah and Nevada mostly, water drains to the interior instead of draining to the oceans. And the Great Salt Lake is a remnant of a gigantic lake that once existed, basically covering Nevada and Utah. So again, basins would be one exception to this idea that all water eventually works its way to the oceans. Okay, now another thing I want to talk about then is management of species. And one of the really important laws, I think, or acts of Congress in the last century was the enactment of the Endangered Species Act. And the Endangered Species Act does a lot of things. One of the things is that it establishes the value of wildlife, stating that they're of aesthetic, ecological, educational, historical, recreational, and scientific value to the nation and its people. And I wholeheartedly agree with that principle. It also, again, it was enacted in 1973, and it, among other things, gives the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service dominion over the Act and administration of the Act. And it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then that will eventually list services in conjunction with interactions with Congress. So the Act also defines endangered species. Endangered species basically are those species that are in danger of becoming extinct in all or part of their range. And again, that's an important phrase. There's some very important phrases in the Endangered Species Act, and that's one of them. Protecting species in all or part of the range, and I'll come back to that. And then a threatened species would be a species that is rapidly declining and in danger of becoming endangered in a short period of time in all or part of its range. So again, as we look at the Endangered Species Act, a couple of the key phrases is, one is that it protects, quote unquote, critical habitat. So the Endangered Species Act is not only protecting species, and there are protections that go to, to the animals and plants that are considered endangered or threatened. But it also protects habitat. And again, that's what it's all about. If you don't have habitat, you don't have organisms. That's something I'll come back to. So an example of this would be the whooping crane. The whooping crane was a population that was very low. I know it was below 50. I think actually that population was below 20 at one time. And so part of this critical habitat was saving their winter nesting grounds, which is on the Gulf of Mexico. But also you then would need to save their summer nesting grounds, which were up in Canada. And so we had an agreement with Canada to protect their nesting grounds there, and we were protecting them along the Gulf Coast. But when you look at the point of critical habitat, it has to go beyond that. That's not going to be enough, because the whooping cranes had to get from the Gulf Coast, Gulf of Mexico, into Canada. And that's not something they can do in a day or even in a single flight. So it's not enough just to protect those areas. If you're going to protect whooping cranes, you have to protect quote unquote critical habitat. So if you look at the whooping crane migration then, what happens is that they would start at the Gulf in the winter, and then they would begin to work north. But they have to stop and rest and feed. So it's not enough just to protect their winter and summer grounds. You also have to protect the flyway. You have to protect the wetlands where they're going to stop and feed so that they can eventually get to that summer nesting area and then retrace their steps in the fall. So again, critical habitat can go well beyond what seems like obvious protections. But again, if you don't protect the habitat, you can't protect the species. Now, again, another key phrase is that protect species in all or part of their range. And the importance of that is that it helps maintain the genetic diversity of a population, a protected population. So one of the characteristics of a small population is that through inbreeding and genetic drift, you end up with a loss of genetic variability. And we talked a little bit about this when we talked about evolution, as a matter of fact. The downstream effect of that is eventually going to be lower reproductive rates, higher mortality, and then a crashing population. So small populations have an inherent problem in that they invariably become less genetically diverse and then generally don't breed well. An example of this, again, something we talked about previously in the semester, is the prairie chicken in Illinois. It was an isolated population, and you can see how the population was crashing, and then also their hatch rate was crashing as well. And when they reintroduced some individuals from another state, so this was, again, in Illinois, so when they brought in birds from Kansas, Nebraska, and other places, brought in some new fresh genes, then you see the population spikes and the hatching success rate spiked as well. So again, it's an important concept to understand that genetic diversity translates to health of a species. And that's an important thing to maintain, and it's required by this particular act. Now, one of the arguments you hear about the Endangered Species Act, to me, is a straw man type argument, but one of the things that opponents will say is that it doesn't work. You've had animals that have been on the list since 1973. And I think the obvious rebuttal to that argument is that the animals still exist. These are animals whose populations were crashing. They were headed for extinction. The fact that you say that they're still here, from 1973, and that they're still here, speaks to the success of the Endangered Species Act. Because again, many of these species would have gone extinct without intervention. So that very argument speaks to the success of the Endangered Species Act. Regardless, it does have some political traction. And so again, there has been within different governmental agencies, some desire to delist species so that they can show politicians, hey, look, we're taking animals off the Endangered Species Act, off the endangered species list, rather. Even when, in my view, they really should still be there. I think they still need those protections. And again, one of these examples would be the grizzly bear. The grizzly bear was delisted a few years ago. And again, they've got some problems. So the population is doing pretty well, and we'll talk about that later, but they have some really important risks ahead for them. And I don't know if I'll have time to talk about that in detail, but some very important food resources for the bears are really at risk, primarily due to global warming. So it doesn't make sense really to delist them now, in my view, because again, they're facing a very hard time in the coming decade, potentially. Another way around the act politically is that, again, some politicians have tried to alter the act so that instead of protecting, quote unquote, all species, or letting the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decide that they just like to protect certain species, so-called keystone species. And the idea behind a keystone species is that there are certain species that will help maintain an ecosystem, that are more important to an ecosystem than others. And again, it's kind of early in testing this hypothesis, but it hasn't really stood up very well to this point. In other words, there's certainly not a single species that you can define as responsible for a particular ecosystem. So the problem with the idea of a keystone species is that it just doesn't hold up well to science. That there may be a few keystone species out there, but they're hard to find. And really almost any species can be defined as a keystone species because it leads to what we call either introduction of a new species or removal of a species leads to what we call a trophic cascade, changes in the food web. And I'll hopefully get a chance to talk about one example of that in a few minutes. So again, hopefully they'll just leave the act alone. Again, if you're a developer, you probably feel differently, but I'm hoping that they just leave the act alone because it is successful and it has saved a number of species. Now, again, with an eye towards species management then, and even as it relates to the Endangered Species Act, one of the things that's important to understand is this concept of island ecosystems. There's a certain reality to ecosystems, and it is that the larger they are, the greater the diversity in terms of the number of species that you find in an ecosystem, also the greater the productivity, greater the biomass, and general health of that ecosystem. And again, if you have isolated ecosystems then, the smaller it is, the smaller the diversity, the less the genetic diversity, and the greater the potential for extinction in island ecosystems. So again, we've learned this by actually studying islands and fragmentations of ecosystems. So again, island ecosystems also can be fragmented ecosystems as we're seeing here. And again, that fragmentation may be due to something like logging. It can also be due to development. So you're getting ecosystems that are being separated by development. And so animals have trouble moving between one area and another. So one of the ways to try to get around this is establish animal corridors so that animals can move freely from one fragment to another. And again, there's some problems with this. In other words, how do you tell the elk or the deer or the bison that it's supposed to go over the bridge as opposed to across the road where the mortality is going to be a lot higher? Do you put a sign up? They don't know necessarily that you've built a corridor for them. So how do they know where they're supposed to go? That's the problem. And again, most of the science suggests that corridors don't work very well. I guess they're better than nothing, but that's really not the way to go. So again, if we look at a situation where you've got an ecosystem and you're fragmenting it into different islands or fragments like this, again, one idea is that you could connect them with corridors. But again, how do the animals know they're supposed to go that way instead of this way and this way and this way? They just may be hungry. They're just looking for forage. This doesn't necessarily mean that they will go that way. And so again, if they get outside of the corridor, mortality is going to be a lot higher. Also, again, the idea of the island, small islands means few individuals, lower genetic diversity, lower species diversity as well. So this is not the best situation. So again, if you do have to develop the area, a better alternative would be to actually combine those into a single area, and then you have a greater single area, a larger island, if you will, and that's a better situation than having the many fragments. Also, another thing to consider is what we call edge effects. In other words, when you look at transitions, natural transitions from one ecosystem to another, you have all kinds of indentations and undulations along the edges. And again, this allows for a more gradual transition. There's generally greater diversity in these kinds of edges. There's also more shelter. There's more chances for prey to avoid predation, things like that, as opposed to forestry where we basically just make hard edges. So so-called edge effects also are significant because in these artificial edges, you again will have less diversity, species diversity, less productivity in this kind of an edge than you would in a natural edge. So again, I think we would do better when we do have to develop to try to develop in a way that mimics nature a little more efficiently. Also, when we destroy habitats, there's always the potential to re-establish habitats. Habitat restoration is an important concept. And so again, with surface mining in particular, it's unbelievable what's possible. You can go from a situation like this to actually back to a natural habitat. It's just that it's very, very expensive. And so again, what's happened across the country is a lot of companies that do this kind of mining, they may go out of business, or they may sell out to another company, and then the company may not restore as they had originally contracted to do with the government. So again, it's, if you want to have species, you've got to have habitat, and so habitat restoration is an important part of that. And again, same thing with forestry. Once you cut down the trees, it's hard to get back to that original ecosystem, because again, succession literally can take hundreds of years. When you look at the lodgepole pine ecosystem, once you cut down the lodgepole pines, you're looking at about 400 years to get back to that old growth forest. Another couple of terms that, or at least a term that I haven't really talked about yet, which is important to the idea of ecosystems, is the concept of niche. Basically, a niche is an organism's job in an ecosystem. Sometimes you'll hear it pronounced niche. And so every organism in an ecosystem has a particular niche. And there's also related to niche this concept of competitive exclusion, which basically says that no two organisms in the same ecosystem can occupy the same niche, that one or the other will always have some slight advantage and overtake the other, basically run the other one out of the ecosystem. So this is a real problem when we look at alien or introduced species. So one of the problems that we're having, certainly in our country, is that we're seeing all kinds of plants being introduced into our ecosystems that were not natural plants. And again, here in California, we have a lot of them. The eucalyptus trees, they're not native to California, they're an Australian plant. You look at something like the tumbleweed, is the Russian thistle. Again, and there are many, many of these. The brown tree snake in Guam is an example, which basically has wreaked havoc in that ecosystem. If you've ever been to the southern United States, there's this plant called kudzu that grows everywhere. That's from Asia. So once you start introducing species, again, there may not be the natural predators there. They begin to compete with, natural vegetation, trying to fill the same niche, and oftentimes they have an advantage, especially if they don't have the same predators, if you will. So what happens then when you remove an animal or an organism from an ecosystem, or if you introduce an organism into an ecosystem, it leads to what we call a trophic cascade. And so one of the places where we've seen this is in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And this involved reintroduction of the wolf. Now, one of the reasons they wanted to reintroduce the wolf to this ecosystem was that, as you may know, the wolves disappeared from that ecosystem, back in the 1930s or so. And so one of the things that the managers began to notice was that basically some of the vegetation, some of the types of trees, forestry was getting old. So particularly aspens. There basically weren't any aspens younger than 30 years of age or so, or 40 years of age. Same is true of willows. There weren't a lot of young willows as well. And so they started doing some different types of tests to try to figure out what the problem was, and the biggest problem actually was elk. And so the key age there is around 10 years. So if you're a young aspen, if you can get up to about 10 years of age, then you're above the height of an elk, and so an elk can't forage on you anymore. Basically, the trunk of the tree and the vegetation is above the reach of the elk. So that was one of the reasons they wanted to reintroduce the wolf, is that the wolf would naturally then begin to predate on the elk, hopefully control the elk population, and then restore the ecosystem's vegetation. Now, the other idea too was focusing on bison, as I talked about earlier. Bison basically have been deforesting that ecosystem to some extent, and so they're also hoping that the wolf might eventually turn to bison and then reduce bison numbers and stop that positive feedback loop that's ongoing related to bison population. So anyway, so some of this was anticipated and some of it worked out the way that it was anticipated, but some of the introduction was interesting in that there were a lot of things going on that had not been anticipated that occurred. So again, just from the introduction of this one animal, bringing back the wolf, again, these are all consequences of that, and this is what we call a trophic cascade. So if I've got it in red, that means that the population crashed. If I have it in green, it means that it increased. So one of the interesting things that was unanticipated was that when the wolf was reintroduced, that the coyote populations crashed. Now you have to understand that prior to the wolf reintroduction, the coyote was literally the top dog in that ecosystem. And so the wolves actually kill coyotes, and no one really had anticipated that before. And it appears to be just an aggressive display of juveniles, learning how to be aggressive, basically. But anyway, wolves kill coyotes. They don't eat them, they just kill them. Anyway, what also happened then was that the fox population increased. So apparently coyotes don't like foxes, and they must have been killing the foxes. So anyway, fox population has increased. And we're not really sure what the downstream effects of that will be, but I guess we'll find out. Now, certainly, the wolf has had an impact on elk and moose populations both. And I should also say that moose can feed on and do feed on aspen and willows as well. And so as those populations have crashed, and that's been a significant crash, that elk population in the northern range of the Yellowstone ecosystem has gone from about 16,000 animals to less than 6,000 in a decade. So it's been significant. Anyway, that then has led to new, basically young aspens and willows, and there's an expansion of those. And as it turns out, beavers also like those, and so there's been an increase in the beaver population. As we talked about earlier, beavers like to build dams across streams. That has increased wetlands, and the downstream effect of that is that it seems to be beneficial for waterfowl, and they're particularly interested in increasing and boosting the numbers of trumpeter swans, and so they think that that has begun to happen. So again, we'll know better with time, but again, this is kind of preliminary information, but it seems that this is the way this trophic cascade is going. Now, increased wetlands also may impact and improve otter populations as well, cause a boost in those. So again, there's some evidence that is happening. Now, in addition, more wolves also mean, by killing elk and moose and bison, it also means that there are more carcasses, more elk, moose, and bison carcasses. And that's also had an unanticipated effect in that actually has improved and increased grizzly populations. So the grizzly population has increased. And again, that was a little bit anticipated. So and the reason it's helping them is that they will steal carcasses from wolves. So if it's a small herd, they will actually steal carcasses from the wolves. And then also, there's some debate about whether this is boosting black bear population as well, because black bears, again, may be scavenging and benefiting from that. So there's some debate about whether that's going to be an effect or not. And then also, as anticipated, as I mentioned before, the the wolf also then, as they've decimated the elk population, have begun to turn to the bison population, and they're learning how to kill and feed on bison. Particularly one pack known as the Molly pack. So anyway, so again, just reintroduction of that one animal is really having a pretty dramatic change in that ecosystem. And I'm sure there's some more that we have not anticipated, and we'll find out what happens with time. So again, this change from a single introduction is a trophic cascade. All right, see you next time.